Bryn Spejcher survived a horrific episode of cannabis-induced psychosis that ended the life of her friend, Chad Amelia. Welcome to the Every Brain Matters podcast. It's just pot. What's the problem? I'm your host, Aubrey Adams, and director of Every Brain Matters. Every Brain Matters is a nonprofit community developed by families negatively impacted by today's industrialized marijuana. Today, we have two special guests, Bryn Spejcher and one of her lawyers, Bob Schwartz. In a moment, I will introduce them. Before we begin, we have done several episodes with the People versus Bryn Spejcher trial, but this will be Bryn's first podcast with Every Brain Matters. By speaking with us today, she will be fulfilling some time for her court-ordered public education. First, I want to acknowledge the Amelia family. I and the Every Brain Matters community give our love and our deepest condolences for the loss of Chad Amelia. Our hearts go out to you. We also want to acknowledge Bryn and the Spejcher family and the pain that they have also experienced as a result of cannabis psychosis. It's important to note that Bryn nearly died that tragic night as well. It is the Every Brain Matters position that Chad Amelia and Bryn Spejcher, both of their families and friends, are all victims of the marijuana industry and the incompetency and corruption of the local, state, and the federal government of the United States of America. In May of 2018, Chad and Bryn, who had just recently met, decided to consume marijuana through a bong. Chad was a daily user. Bryn had only used marijuana about 10 times prior to this night with no adverse effects. The bong was stacked with a lot of marijuana smoke, and Bryn inhaled not knowing that this large amount of marijuana smoke could lead her into a full psychotic break and cause her to act out violently towards Chad, her dog, and herself. Bryn survived that night only because of the intervention of the Ventura County Police. Bryn's dog also survived, but Chad did not. Bryn was convicted of involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to 3 years of probation, which includes providing 100 hours of public education on CIP, cannabis-induced psychosis. And now I'd like to introduce Bryn and Bob Schwartz. Bob, we thank you for being here and providing valuable information on the legality of California's law on cannabis psychosis, and we look forward to learning more from you. Bryn, we also thank you for having the courage to go on national TV and this podcast to educate the public about cannabis psychosis and how it has changed your life and the life of others. We are grateful you survived to warn others and help prevent this from happening to other families. Bryn, please describe who you are and the reasons for becoming an audiologist.
Hi, my name is Bryn, and I'm a doctor of audiology. My journey into the field began in undergraduate studies, where I initially focused on speech-language pathology. And at my college, we had the opportunity to work with children who primarily needed speech or language services. But by junior year, I had an opportunity to work with two young siblings who had severe hearing loss and planned oral rehabilitation services. And around this time, I was also taking courses in audiology, which solidified my decision to pursue this career. I also have a personal connection to the field because I've experienced severe hearing loss and have utilized binaural hearing aids for the past 30 years. And this personal experience, combined with my academic and clinical background, has driven my commitment to helping others with hearing issues or challenges.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you, Bryn. Now I'd like to welcome Bob Schwartz. He is the leading criminal defense attorney in Los Angeles for 43 years and has handled some of the most high-profile, complex, and challenging cases. Bob, we welcome you. Is there anything else you'd like to add to your introduction? And could you describe the events of the night the incident happened with Bryn?
Well, first of all, a little background. Bryn had met the victim, Chad Amelia, about a month before this incident happened. And during that month period, they got to know each other. Bryn had been in his condominium a few times. Chad was a heavy user of marijuana. We know that he purchased high potency marijuana. By contrast, Bryn was a naive and inexperienced user of marijuana, really had gotten high only one time in her life. And the symptoms that she experienced on that occasion were basically lightheadedness and giggling. So, and that's it. So on the night that this happened, Bryn came over to the residence of Chad, and they were hanging out for a while. And then Chad went outside and he lit up his bong, and he convinced Bryn to smoke out of the bong. She did, and nothing happened. She had no effect at all, which is consistent with her prior reaction to using marijuana. So some time went by. I think it was 20 minutes, half an hour, and he was pushing Bryn to inhale from the bong a second time. And Bryn really didn't want to, and she told him that, but she gave in and she smoked out of the bong a second time. But there was something different. The bowl of the bong the second time had a milky substance. It looked like Chad had altered the bong to create a double effect. And Bryn can tell you more about that. But in any event, it was different. And we know it was different because of the reaction that Bryn had. Shortly after inhaling from the bong the second time that night, Bryn knew there was something seriously wrong. She went to the bathroom. She started coughing incessantly. She was lightheaded. She felt sick. She came after spending a few moments in the bathroom. She came back to the living room where Chad was. She laid down on the sofa, and then she started experiencing severe hallucinations and delusions. Sometime shortly after that, she retrieved at least one knife and maybe more from a butcher block in the kitchen area, and she began stabbing Chad. We know that there were 108 stab injuries to Chad. That doesn't mean she stabbed him 108 times, because one stab injury can result from one actual puncture. So you could have a puncturing of the skin, and it could intersect with an internal organ. So it was 108 stab injuries, a lot. She also inadvertently stabbed her beloved dog. Bryn also, and we know this from video, which I'll explain in a moment, stabbed herself repeatedly. Now, when I talk about video, what am I referring to? One of Chad's roommates called 911. Ventura County Sheriff's Department arrived, and one of the officers, at least one, was wearing what's known as body-worn video. So we were able to see, and the jury saw in real time, Bryn in the middle of this extreme psychotic reaction, stabbing herself. We saw and heard on the video one of the deputies commanding Bryn, yelling at Bryn to drop the knife. She kept stabbing herself. One of the deputies then tased her 4 times with a taser gun, and the taser wires, they landed in Bryn's body. She still kept stabbing herself because at this point she was impervious to pain. One of the other deputies then got close enough to her and used his steel-tipped baton to strike her 9 times. In the process, by the way, breaking her arm. Finally, on the 9th attempt, he was able to dislodge the knife from Bryn's hand. This is all visible on the video. And while this is taking place, we hear Bryn issuing blood-curdling screams, something you'd see out of a horror movie. So there's no question that Bryn was deep into a psychotic stage and she was literally out of her mind. So Chad died that night. Bryn was taken to hospital for emergency treatment. She went through, I believe, a couple surgeries. Then the detectives swooped down on her and started asking her questions. During the first interview by the detectives, Bryn was unable to speak. She was intubated as a result of the severe stab wounds to her neck that she had perpetrated, and she couldn't actually speak. So she had to write out the responses to the questions that they were posing to her. And one of the notes that she wrote, which became part of the evidence in the case, she said, I told Chad I didn't want to smoke anymore. He forced me to take the second hit. And that became part of our defense in this case, which was what's known as involuntary intoxication.
Thank you for describing that, Bob. I can't imagine going through that again and watching Bryn's reaction to the description is not a walk in the park. And I want to recognize the courage from both of you, Bob and Bryn, for speaking up about this cannabis-induced psychosis experience and how horrific it was. So thank you for describing that. I also want to welcome Heidi Anderson-Swan and Dr. Christy Brown, my fellow colleagues and advocates who were in the courtroom of the trial, and they're going to ask a few questions later on. But let's start with this question, and we'll go to Bryn first and then Bob. Bryn, had you ever heard of cannabis-induced psychosis before this incident? And if you had, did you know it could cause people to act violently?
I never heard of cannabis-induced psychosis until 3 years after the tragic incident. Bob emailed me in May of 2021, and he sent me a couple articles about drug or cannabis-induced psychosis. And I was also planning on meeting with a renowned expert in drug-induced psychosis named Dr. William Wershing, who later testified at my trial. And despite the awful incident, it gave some sort of relief in explaining what happened that night. But never in a million years would I have thought cannabis could cause anyone to act violently. I never heard of anyone using marijuana, legal or illegal use, experience this type of negative effect. And I only heard or witnessed behavior where they were like just super stoned or super relaxed or had food cravings or just chill. But I never knew with just cannabis that something like this would happen.
It's remarkable that you didn't learn what happened to you that night until years later. What about you, Bob? Have you heard of cannabis-induced psychosis before and it's linked to violence?
I had heard of cannabis induced psychosis, but in a slightly different context. I had read about some incidents where someone was claiming, someone after committing some horrible acts of violence was claiming that it was a result of ingesting marijuana in some form, whether it was from a bong or from a marijuana joint. But in all those prior incidents that I had read about, as I read further, it did look like the person who had been using marijuana had some underlying mental illness or mental disorder, schizophrenia, for example. I was unaware of the capability of marijuana to produce a psychotic reaction of the kind that Bryn experienced for someone like Bryn, who has no mental illness, no mental disorder, no mental impairment, and no history of it, and no history of violence. So for me, this was new. And as I got further into the case, it was, and by the way, I want to thank Dr. Brown and Heidi for their contributions to my expanding knowledge on this subject. I was really awakened to the reality of the risk of high potency marijuana. So yeah, so in terms of someone having kind of psychotic reaction with no mental history or no present mental, yeah, this was a new thing for me.
Yes, as for so many, even hearing this podcast for the first time. Many times when people educate, like when Christy, Heidi, or I educate about cannabis psychosis, we get a backlash of denial and are accused of reefer madness, and that we are just trying to scare people. As a matter of fact, I just got a message a few minutes ago calling me Aubrey Reefer Madness on the X platform. Bryn, what are your thoughts about this when people deny and say it's reefer madness?
I think it's understandable that when discussing cannabis-induced psychosis, that most people might react defensively, dismissing it as exaggerated or maybe like as the scare tactic like those seen in reefer madness. However, the reality is that the conversation around cannabis and its potential risk has evolved significantly because today and in the future, there's going to be more research and clinical evidence to support the fact that cannabis can, in some individuals, trigger or exacerbate psychotic episodes, especially in those with maybe, like Bob said, some mental health issues, or they manipulate a bong a certain way or add something to it. And while I think it's important to acknowledge that it does have risks, and educating people about the risks that individuals can make, so individuals can make informed decisions about their well-being, whether you're the regular user or a novice user.
No. What about you, Bob? What do you have to say about when people are yelling, no, that's just reefer madness and it's not true?
This is really a complicated issue. And I say that because the experience that Bryn had and the whole concept of marijuana causing a psychotic reaction, it runs counter to the experience of the vast majority of marijuana users, not only in the United States, but probably all over the world. It runs counter to their experience and it runs counter to their beliefs. But we learn it's a real thing. And it's really what has changed. And I think that during our trial, a number of our experts help explain that to the jury, is what has exploded is the potency level of the marijuana. The average marijuana user is using marijuana probably of relatively low concentration, low potency. And even for those who use higher potency marijuana, it's likely that they are a chronic user of marijuana and have built up a tolerance and therefore can cope with high potency marijuana without reaching the point where they are losing cognitive or conscious awareness of their actions. And so a piece of this whole conversation has to do with the fact that the marijuana industry, and make no mistake, the marijuana industry in California, I'm sure in other places, is a billion-dollar industry. And it's not really, and it's not regulated. It's regulated in terms of licenses and tech, but it's not regulated in terms of the potency. Like on cigarettes, there's a mandated federal label that that the cigarette could cause cancer. And for the most part, when people walk into a dispensary and they buy a high potency marijuana product, there's no warning label. So the general public doesn't get, and I can understand why, the extreme potency of marijuana products that people can purchase legally at dispensaries, and then the effect that those high potency marijuana products can have on them, and especially if they're like Bryn, a naive or inexperienced user of marijuana.
Yeah, very well said. Next, I want to ask you about involuntary intoxication versus involuntary psychosis and go over the legal definition. We were under the impression that there was no laws about involuntary psychosis, but now we have come to understand that involuntary psychosis falls under the definition of involuntary intoxication in California. Could
I jump in? I'll bring and explain that. All right.
Yeah, please do.
Let me give a little primer on the law to try to put things into context. So Bryn, for over 3 years, was charged with murder. Our experts concluded that Bryn was in a psychotic state, cannabis-induced psychotic state at the time of the killing, the time she stabbed herself as well, of course, and that she had no conscious or cognitive awareness of what she was doing. The turning point on this case was that the prosecution retained their own expert, somebody who testifies primarily for the prosecution, especially for prosecutors in this county. And over our objection, he was allowed to conduct an evaluation of Bryn. So he spent a day with Bryn, doing a clinical interview, administering psychological tests, etc. And that expert came to the exact same conclusion as our experts, which was that Bryn did not have any conscious or cognitive awareness of her actions. And by the way, the video would confirm that to anyone. So the prosecutor, to her credit, realized that she couldn't prove murder, and proving murder would require her to prove that Bryn had an intention to kill, with or without premeditation or deliberation, and she couldn't prove second-degree murder or what's known as reckless and wanton conduct murder, because to prove that she'd have to establish that Bryn had a subjective awareness of what she was doing. She obviously did not. So the prosecutor did the right thing, to her credit, and dismissed the murder and reduced the charge to involuntary manslaughter. So we went to trial on the charge of involuntary manslaughter. Our defense at the trial was what is known as involuntary intoxication. The prosecutor's argument is that it was a voluntary intoxication, that Bryn knew exactly what she was doing, what the effects would be, contrary to the evidence, I would say, and that prosecutor compared what Bryn did by inhaling from the bong the second time as the equivalent of a DUI case. The defense in California of involuntary intoxication requires the defense to prove that the intoxication that they experienced was either the result of coercion or fraud or trickery. And our contention at the trial was that we proved both of those things. We proved, we believe, the coercion because Bryn had written the first communication with the detectives. She wrote that note saying, I didn't want to smoke anymore, and he made me or forced me to take the second hit from the bong. The trickery or fraud claim that we made as a prerequisite of proving involuntary intoxication was that Chad knew what the effect of marijuana could be, and Bryn did not. And how he knew is his roommate, the same roommate who called 911 that night, had inhaled out of that same bong previously. And that roommate had a psychotic reaction. That roommate smoked out of that bong, and he thought he was going to die. He was having contortions and hallucinations. He was seeing contorted faces. And he felt at the time, after inhaling from that bong, that he needed to take all his clothes off and run out into the street naked. That sounds like a psychotic reaction. And what we presented to the jury and was that Chad knew that, Bryn didn't. And that met the definition of trickery or fraud. And that Bryn, had she known that, would never have inhaled from that marijuana bong. If Chad had told her about what the reaction was of the roommate smoking from exactly the same bong. And Bryn testified at the trial. I asked her the question, if you had known what happened to Vinny was the roommate, if you had known what happened to Vinny when he previously inhaled from the bong, would you have inhaled from the same bong? And Bryn's answer at trial was, not only would I not have inhaled from, I would never use marijuana the rest of my life. So anyway, that was what the defense was at the trial. Unfortunately, the jury didn't accept our defense, and they convicted Bryn of involuntary manslaughter.
Yes, and then the sentencing is what the media and the general public have an outcry about. They blame Bryn mostly for this act that night, and not necessarily what happened, the effects of marijuana on her brain. And I just want to know, Bob, in your opinion, who is to blame for that night? What happened to Bryn that night?
Well, I don't think Bryn is. Now, the question is Chad to blame? And I told this to the jury in my closing argument. I don't believe Chad didn't mean any harm. And by the way, as a backdrop, there was never any animosity or antagonism between Chad and Bryn. I mean, she had no motive to hurt him. On the other hand, he had no motive to cause harm to her. So Chad had no idea. I don't think he had some idea because of what happened to the roommate, but he never for a moment thought that Bryn would lapse into a psychotic state and stab him countless times and stab herself. I don't. So, in our society, we have a tendency, a need to attribute blame or culpability to somebody. Maybe this is one of these situations in life where there is no blame to be attributed to. Chad was the one, it was his bond. He knew what was in the bond. He knew the potency of what was in the bond. Bryn did not. But he didn't know and could not possibly have known what kind of reaction that Bryn would have.
Just like the majority of people don't understand that this could happen. Bryn, what kind of questions do you think people should ask if they want to use marijuana to protect themselves?
I mean, definitely, the potential risks associated with marijuana use and understanding the short-term or long-term effects, a risk of addiction, mental health issues, impacting cognitive function. They might want to consider if they have personal or family history of mental health issues. Is marijuana even legal in their state? Are they of age? How will the marijuana even affect if they're taking medications? What's a safe dosage for them? Are they a new user, a frequent user, an addictive user? And what type of method of consumption do they need to take in order for it to be safe for them? What are the signs of cannabis-induced psychosis and how it can be prevented? So recognizing the signs of psychosis and attending to that and helping that person if they're experiencing paranoia or whatever it is, and not just watch them lay down on the bed or the couch. Maybe, do something about that. Accessing reliable information that's true to support the evidence of adverse effects of marijuana. It's kind of the main ones I kind of thought about. How about, I don't know if anybody else wants to add to that?
Yeah, what about you, Bob? What do you think people should ask about legal marijuana? And just to expand on that, if a person does have a psychotic break and become violent and commit crimes, what is their legal responsibility in the state of California?
Right. And I'd like to answer that, but could we go back to the previous question that you posed, having to do with the public reaction? I think this is important.
Yes.
The headline, the screaming headline throughout the United States and probably the world is woman who stabs man 108 times gets probation. On the surface, shocking, right? I mean, I heard commentary from so-called legal pundits on various television stations and channels, and it was some of the most ill-informed commentary I ever heard. The judge made a courageous decision, but to be clear, he totally made the right decision. Unlike the public and these pundits who didn't know much about the case, he was there the whole trial. He knew the evidence. And his decision, I think, took into account everything, Bryn's background, the fact that, and the judge mentioned this at sentencing, that the reaction that Bryn had could not be foreseen. That was crucial. And one other thing for the public to understand, when the story was first reported, I'm sure some people in other parts of the country and the world were saying, "Oh, there goes some nutty California judge again." Well, this judge, very experienced, long time sitting judge in homicide cases, relatively conservative, very thoughtful, very bright man, wonderful man. And he got it right. And so you have to understand the entire context of this case before anyone can judge Bryn with the as the headlines were saying that she got away with murder. No, this was not a murder, and she didn't get away with it because she didn't even know what she was doing. Now, to go back to your more recent question, Aubrey, what I would encourage people who are not experienced or frequent users of marijuana, if they're going to use, they should find out what the potency level is of the product that they're using. This is crucial, especially because we learned from one of our experts in the case, Dr. Dan Buffington, that there are marijuana products that are available to the public right now that are like 80%, 85%, 90%. This is insane. I mean, when I was in college, the potency of marijuana that people was using was like 3%, 4%, 5%. I mean, Chad was purchasing marijuana, the potency in the 30s, but 85 or 90%, this is dangerous stuff. So, I think users of marijuana really need to be vigilant to find out what exactly is the product that they're using.
And if they do have a psychotic episode and become violent and commit crimes, what is their legal responsibility in the state of California?
Well, if they're using the product voluntarily, and again, our claim, for good reason, was that this was not a voluntary usage by Bryn. I mean, she smoked out of the bong the first time that I had no reaction. So why would she think in smoking out of the bong the second time that she'd have a psychotic reaction? And even the fact that there was a milky substance in the bong the second time because of the way that Chad perhaps prepared it differently the second time. Why would she know that she was going to engage in this hugely violent psychotic episode? And so the responsibility for someone, if they voluntarily consume marijuana that results in a psychotic reaction and they commit acts of violence, they could likely be guilty of the crime of involuntary manslaughter. Now, and now, depending on their mental state, they also could be guilty of murder. Bryn was not guilty of murder because all the experts agreed that she had no conscious or cognitive awareness of what she was doing. That could be different in other cases. Somebody might be aware of what they're doing, that they didn't experience this gross level of psychosis that we saw in Bryn, and it was revealed in the video.
Yes. And Bob, I know we just have a few minutes left with you, so I wanted to turn this over to Heidi and Christy to see if they had a question or two to ask you before you need to go tonight.
Sure.
Well, I was wondering if, Bob, you could compare what would happen if somebody consumed alcohol and committed a crime, because there's a lot of evidence that alcohol can contribute to violent behavior, and people, I think, understand that a lot more than they do about marijuana. So is there a difference? You said that the prosecutor compared this to a DUI, but there's also people that commit crimes under the influence of alcohol. Isn't this the same type of situation, or is there a difference?
Well, I can tell you what the courts have held. The courts in California have held that for someone to be drinking to the point where they are intoxicated, significantly impaired or drunk, and then become involved in an accident and someone dies, they can be prosecuted for second-degree murder. And the distinction, and by the way, there is no, for someone who is aware of potential psychotic effects of marijuana, there's no difference between that person and someone who is drinking and then drinks and drives and kills someone. And you could use marijuana and drive and kill someone, and you're in the same legal boat as someone who drinks and drives and kill someone. And we call that in California a Watson murder because of a California Supreme Court decision, People versus Watson, that established that liability or culpability for people. But the dividing line between that and Bryn's case, of course, is that her intoxication was involuntary. You know, and I drew this distinction with the jury in my closing argument. Say, look, this is not like a DUI case. In a DUI case, whether it results in a killing or not, the person, unless they've never consumed alcohol their whole life, they know what the likely effects of alcohol would be. They know that the more you drink, the more impaired you are, and the more you are less able to safely operate a dangerous weapon like a car. So it's a willful act in the drunk driving context, the consumption of alcohol. It's a willful act where someone would be likely expected to know the consequences of their action. Now, again, that could be true of marijuana if someone was aware of the potential psychotic effects of marijuana. And even if they weren't aware of the psychotic effect, they would know the risk of using marijuana and then going out and driving, because even if it doesn't cause psychosis, as we all know, marijuana can cause other reactions in the human body that impair someone's ability to drive safely. Did that answer your question at all?
Well, I was actually thinking about more alcohol psychotic effects, or people being drunk, blackout drunk, and there's a lot of domestic violence that alcohol contributes to. Even homicides. So
Yeah, I
that's
mean, I think
beyond. I know that there's a case in San Diego where a woman consumed marijuana and she killed 2 people when she was driving because she drove afterwards. But I'm talking about more violent crime, alcohol-related violent crime is the laws.
There is a legal defense known as voluntary intoxication, which does apply to alcohol, but it only goes so far. It does not generally negate someone's criminal liability. Without getting too much into the weeds and legal analysis and legal theory, there are 2 kinds of crimes generally. There's what's known as specific intent crimes and general intent crimes. And the use of alcohol is never a defense to a general intent crime. A specific intent crime would be a crime such as robbery or residential burglary, where you commit a crime and you have an intent to achieve a further consequence. In the case of, let's say, robbery, because you take property with the specific intent of acquiring that property and keeping that property. So voluntary intoxication can negate the specific element component of a specific intent crime, but not for a general intent crime. Now, let me just say this. As a practical matter, my experience of being a trial attorney for many years, jurors hate the defense of voluntary intoxication. The average juror's perception is you don't have the right to get high, have a good time and get high, and then do something horrible, and then claim later that your liability for your actions is excused by the intoxication, whether it's alcohol or drugs.
That's a good point. I mean, we're talking about involuntary intoxication versus involuntary psychosis, where, Bob, have you ever been involved in a trial with alcohol-induced psychosis?
I've had many cases where my client had been drinking and then they blacked out.
Okay.
Now, psychosis is it's a different mental process. Psychosis is a process where someone's not completely blacked out. They may not be cognitively consciously aware, but they're moving. They're moving around, they're taking actions. And that's a little different than a pure blackout, alcohol-induced blackout.
Yes, and that's what we try to provide, that education, because they try to compare marijuana to alcohol, and it's really not. I mean, you can become psychotic from alcohol, but you have to abuse it for many, many years, like 30, 40 years, your whole life. But with marijuana, just one use can induce that psychotic episode. So that's what Christy, Heidi, and I spend so much time educating the public about, because we have lived this with our loved ones too. So that's why we are so passionate about raising awareness about this and its potential link to violence. So we really appreciate you being here tonight. I think, Bob, if you have a few more minutes, I think it's okay if Heidi asks her question without video on. Is that okay?
Sure.
Are you sure you have time, Bob? It's 5:17.
Sure. Go ahead. I have a few more minutes. Yeah.
I was kind of amazed about Ventura County. They had Calvin Sharp, who killed a young boy from cannabis-induced psychosis, and Bryn Spejcher's horrific reaction. But there's also Ian David Long, who was a mass shooter, and he shot up. He killed 13 people, died one night, and the only things in his system were nicotine, caffeine, and THC. And so Ventura County has really suffered from cannabis and the negative effects of it. But why aren't they warning their own community? It's cost them a ton. How much did this trial cost? How much did the Calvin Sharp trial cost? I mean, it's a tragedy, and they're not warning the public.
Right. Well, it's a cultural thing. I mean, I think Ventura County it has a unique combination of demographics. If our case had been held in Los Angeles County, I am more inclined to think that the jury might have found involuntary intoxication for Bryn and acquitted her. But our case was where it was in Ventura. So, the culture of Ventura, it's very conservative. It's very pro-prosecution. It's very pro-law enforcement. I think the average juror, and they would never acknowledge it because they probably are not even aware of it. I think the average juror believes that their duty as a juror in a criminal case is to return a verdict of guilty. That's their civic duty. It's like, who's driving the bus here? Is it the public, the jurors, or is it the district attorney's office? Is it the police? That's hard to say, but it's a totally different environment than Los Angeles in terms of the expense. It's hard to calculate. I mean, there are figures that illustrate how expensive it is to run a courtroom every day. But that's not. I don't think that is a factor at all in the thinking process of the prosecutor's office in Ventura County. I don't think that comes into play at all.
That they don't want to warn the public?
Yeah, I mean,
that there should be billboards or something, or warning labels?
I mean, of course, I think that they should. And, and it's a great question. Why don't they? I mean, frankly, why don't they do it in Los Angeles? I mean,
Yeah.
I can't recall seeing any public announcements, billboards or otherwise, bus bench announcements in Los Angeles warning people of the dangers of high potency marijuana. I mean, if it's out there, I haven't seen it. And again, when we clash here, I think, with an obvious economic imperative, which is that the marijuana industry is a heavy hitter in politics. It's a billion-dollar industry. They contribute to politicians of all political stripes and persuasions. They've got a lot of influence, and I can imagine they don't want to see this. Look, the cigarette industry fought tooth and nail against the warning labels on cigarette packages, which I think, as I recall, goes back to the 1970s. So I don't know. I mean, there needs to be, and it's a great question, there needs to be an impetus. And people like you and Dr. Brown are creating some of that impetus. But it's you're running, we all are at this point, I think. We're running counter to the mainstream culture. And so there's a lot of education that needs to take place here.
Agreed. Agreed. And it's astounding to me that the industry and our government, who isn't fighting for public health warnings, that they just get to walk away scot-free and they let Bryn Spejcher and the Amelia family duke it out. Your problem, people. It's not ours.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that there was actually, you found a warning on the material that Chad had bought previously that said for tolerant users only. That was from the
That's a
dispensary.
great point. And
Yeah.
the warning label, of course, see, Bryn never saw this. Chad did, he bought it. And actually, I'm not even sure that it was on the packaging of
It was on the
of
website.
marijuana. It was on the website. So the website said for the percentage, a potency percentage of the product that Chad was purchasing, it said, warning, high tolerance users only. That's a website, but I don't think it was on any packaging. And certainly Bryn was one step removed from that. There's no way she would have known that, unless of course Chad had told her, and he didn't.
But they were obviously aware that there could be some problems with that
Yeah.
strain for people like Bryn and Vinny, the roommate.
Yes.
Yeah, and it also shows that the industry understands that there are negative effects with marijuana. They don't admit it to the public, but they know it, which is,
Well, yeah,
that warning.
and I would point out something, and I have to go, is think about what we learned about the knowledge of the cigarette industry. The cigarette industry, from what I know, knew in the 1950s that that cigarette smoke can cause cancer, and they hid that. So, uh, what did it take to finally get this out? And so we have it's a parallel universe now with marijuana as opposed to cigarette smoke. Going back to, I remember as a little kid, there were television commercials for cigarettes, um, um, praising the health benefits of smoking cigarettes. Do any of you remember that? It's crazy, right? But that actually happened. So it's the same thing. Anyway, listen, it's a pleasure seeing all of you. I hope this has been beneficial, and I look forward to speaking with all of you again.
Yeah,
Oh,
thanks,
Bob,
Bob,
it's
for
an honor.
participating in this groundbreaking case.
Thank you
I'm
so
sure
much.
we learned a lot from it.
Thank you for
Bob.
all your support. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Bob.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Well, I just wanted to know, Bryn, if have you been coping since the verdict, and how's your journey been since then? Has it gotten easier for you, or because you seem to be in a fairly calm, good state right now.
Well, you're looking at a self-medicated person. So I've been on prescribed medications for years now because of this incident. Um, but since the verdict, I think it was very devastating just all around. And I think I just felt so defeated knowing that I'm still innocent in this and I'm
Mhm.
defending my life, even though another life was lost in this whole tragic story. And it was also weird because Judge Worley wasn't there of the day of the verdict. And I have questions about that sometimes, that day. And the next court date wasn't until the following Monday. The verdict was Friday. The following Monday was another court date with Judge Worley.
Mhm.
And the fact that I wasn't incarcerated made everybody in the room, my side and Chad's side, probably very confused and frustrated all around.
Mhm.
And that whole weekend, I was just with my family and we were just so like, we just felt like we worked so hard to fight for my case. And, that my lawyers did such a good job with their defense and how encouraging they were and hopeful that they were throughout trial and that we had this strong case. And when that Monday court date happened, I still wasn't incarcerated. And the judge let everybody go home and scheduled the sentencing court date January 23rd of 2024.
Mhm.
So, I'm like asking my lawyers, like, am I allowed to go home? Like, am I like, what is happening here? I think everybody in that room was just like, what? Like, it just made no sense in terms of like the court of law. Like, usually when somebody's guilty of something serious, they're incarcerated right away.
Right.
So that those 2 months that I was able to go home was probably the darkest point in my life. And I didn't know if like this is gonna be the last time that I'm gonna do this, do that here, do something like this with my family, see the pets, do all the things that I enjoyed doing at home. I didn't see any of my friends. I was it, it was just it was so scary because I didn't know, it was still that uncertainty that I didn't know
Mhm.
what was going to happen, even after 5.5 years leading up to trial, and I still got the verdict, but nothing was happening. Still nothing was decided, so I still didn't know if I was going to prison, going to jail. I was going through transfer paperwork. So am I going to be in jail in California or Illinois? Um, I took care of some medical needs and made sure I got a second pair of hearing aids in case the prison doesn't allow rechargeable hearing aids. I mean, just stupid, silly things like that. I was looking up accommodations in prison and literally
Did you think
studying.
you were going to prison? Did you really think did you
Oh,
think there was?
yeah. Yes. Yes. I really did. I mean, I think during that time, I was also reaching out to friends and family to write letters for the judge because everybody on both sides had the opportunity to write letters on, you know, why I shouldn't be in prison or what,
Mhm.
the best outcome would be for me. And I'm sure Chad's family, they explained why I should be in prison. I mean, it was just such a weird tomb. It was awful. It was just awful. And obviously sentencing was a shock to everybody in the room. You heard both sides of the courtroom. I didn't even really hear what the judge said because I have hearing loss, and I had to look over to my lawyer, like,
Yeah,
my
Heidi and I were
and
there. Heidi and I were there. I mean, it was so dramatic, the whole thing. And when you were, talking to Chad's family and expressing your remorse and everything, that was so heart-wrenching. So,
Mhm.
it was obviously so hard for everybody.
It's just devastating all around because we're talking about a human life that's lost, and it's like going through the court system with this. It's just awful in so many different ways, in so many different perspectives, and for everybody in that room. And of course, I'm so grateful for Judge Worley for making that decision. And Bob was right that he knew all the evidence of that case, and he, I believe, also made the right choice to do that. And since sentencing, of course, I'm still trying to process what just happened over the last 6 years. It's never gonna go away. I'm still on prescribed medication. I still can't get a job. I don't have my state license. I've been getting rejected by jobs because I have a felony charge. And then I'm being court ordered to for public education about this story. And so while that's a good thing, at the same time, it's traumatic every time. Like, I literally hate doing this.
You have
but
to
I
go
know
through it. Yeah, every time you have to go through it.
right. I hate doing this because it's awful. It's an awful story. It hurts me, my family, and Chad's family and friends. And it's just, but I understand the importance of doing this is because to spread awareness and education to the public, that of course, yes, and I'm gonna want to do this. It's just I'm doing it sooner than later.
Yeah.
And I do want to summarize that in order for me to get through these months, it was prescribed medications from my doctor, being around my friends and family and my inner circle of people who I trust, my faith in God, and just doing what I can every day to survive. And whether that was to lay in bed all day or to go for a walk or to eat something, it's what I had to do to survive, to get through every day for the last 6 years.
Well, you appreciate all that you've been doing.
I just want to say it was a profoundly moving experience to be in trial every day. I'm grateful that Christy was there with me because a lot of times I was like, what just happened? And she would have to explain it. But we felt so deeply for you, for your family, for Chad, for his family. It's so horrific, and we're grateful and we're honored to be working with you to help prevent this from other people from suffering needless suffering.
I also want to add that I have spent time with Bryn, interviewing her, and she is an intelligent, nonviolent person. If this can happen to Bryn, this can happen to anyone. In conclusion, I want the audience to know Bryn has expressed that even if the judge didn't sentence her to providing education on cannabis-induced psychosis, that she would have dedicated her life to raising awareness about it because she wants to help prevent this from happening to other people. If you'd like Bryn to come speak to your community or organization to help you raise awareness about cannabis psychosis and its connection to violence, please contact us at info@everybrainmatters.org. Thank you for joining us today for this life-saving discussion about Bryn Spejcher and cannabis-induced psychosis. Again, Our deepest condolences to everyone who knew and loved Chad O'Melia. To help us raise awareness about the harms of marijuana, please like, comment, and share this podcast. And please visit us at everybrainmatters.org.